In the meantime, folks, crooked Judge Juan Merchan has delayed President Trump's sentencing to mid-September. But there was one part of the announcement that caught our eye. Merchan wrote, the court will convene that day, quote, if such an event is still necessary, end quote. The delay was implemented so Trump can appeal the case in light of the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. Some say that could be a positive for President Trump. On the other hand, the timing of all of this raising a lot of questions, as the sentencing date would be very, very close to the election. For more, let's bring in former New York State judge, former prosecutor, and host of the Rich Giardino show, Rich Giardino. Good to see you, sir. The focus on Merchan's lament, if such a thing is necessary, to me, that suggests that Trump's appeal could be heard before sentencing, and Merchan knows how crooked his case was from the jump, and it will likely be overturned. I'm no lawyer, so let me just ask you, is it possible an appeals court could hear this case before the sentencing date?
No, I think what Merchan was saying, I agree with you, it's going to be reversed on appeal, whether it's the state court that does it or the federal court. But what Merchan is saying, if necessary, and I think what he means is, if he doesn't set aside the case based on the immunity decision, then there will be a sentencing in September. So he's not talking about the appeal, he's talking about his actions, because after a conviction in New York State, you have a right to ask the judge to set aside the verdict based on the law or the evidence. And what's interesting is, since Trump's been convicted, the law changed on immunity. So that's going to set the judge up with an interesting question.
Well, to this point, Mr. Merchan has shown no ethics whatsoever. What do you think? Do you actually think that he would actually look at the Supreme Court ruling, that he would be painted into a corner, that he had no other choice than to undo this?
Well, speaking from a legal standpoint, I think that he has to review it in a fair way. I don't see that happening. Politically, if you're one of those people that believe this is a political prosecution, what Merchan is going to do is, I would bet he's going to dismiss several counts and say that, well, the immunity applied to this act because it was an official act, but it didn't apply to this act because it was personal. And some of the witnesses that testified, their testimony should be stricken because they were talking about official acts. So I think what he's going to try to do is Solomon-esque, split the baby so he can say, oh, look, I was so fair, missed 10 counts. That way he's hoping appellate court looks and says, well, the judge was fair. He reviewed it and he dismissed 10 counts. So it's pretty interesting, because when the Supreme Court ruled, they said there's three areas: official acts, personal acts, and the inside gray area, which lower courts will have to interpret. They sent it back to the circuit court in the D.C. case. So what they're going to do is Merchan is going to review that center and say, well, this one is personal, this one is official. And he's going to say, maybe this witness testified to something they should not have testified to because it was in the official capacity. That's what I'm betting.
Okay.
Chris. I think.
Well, if Merchan tries to split the baby, I've already got a response teed up for that. Meantime, Rich, the Justice Department, the Injustice Department, I should say, they say they're not going to stop this lawfare against President Trump, even if he wins election. Officials telling the Washington Post that they'll keep on probing all the way up until Inauguration Day if President Trump is the victor. Meanwhile, the 2020 election case is delayed, and the Georgia case is also on hold, and the so-called classified documents case is imploding under government corruption and government illegality. Then there's the Justice Department, the Injustice Department, refusing to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland accountable for defying a lawful congressional subpoena, while Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro are rotting in prison. Rich, why do you think Democrats are so emboldened to continue to abuse our justice system?
Because they can. And it's funny, you call it the injustice system. I refer to it as the just us Department of Justice. So just us. In other words, just us Democrats, just us. We're going to see who gets justice and who doesn't. And what's fascinating to me, Chris, is that all these cases are falling apart before our very eyes. And can you imagine, like Fannie Willis, her special prosecutor ended up going to the White House. What the heck's a special prosecutor going to the White House for when this political case is pending? There's so many issues in all these. And what's funny is, if Biden does step down, and I think, by the way, it's another topic someday, Chris, But they set him up by making him go and do the debate, because as soon as it was over, Joe Scarborough, CNN, this guy, after they spent 2 months saying fake news from Newsmax, fake news from Fox, everybody is showing improper clips to make Joe look like he doesn't know what he's doing. And you see it for your own eyes. And they piled right on him and started demanding his head and that he go. So I think it was a setup, number one. Number two, now the question is, they started all these prosecutions. And if you believe that it's lawfare and it was intended to get rid of Trump as an opponent, now what do they do if Biden's no longer the candidate? You know, it's an interesting setup that they've done.
Well, true. And you're not the only one out there saying that some elements of the Democrat Party set up Joe Biden to be exposed after they spent the last 3.5, 4 years covering for him. Look, I've only got about 35 seconds left, but I want you to comment on this. You're from New York, a place that is ruled, as you know, by majority of self-identified socialists. How do those socialists mark Independence Day? Do they all wear black or what?
For the rest of it, it's a celebration of our independence from Great Britain and from the rule. And people, to know the history, a lot of the Declaration of Independence before the Constitution was because of taxation and unfair. And it's funny because the old white guys said they weren't going to be slaves to Great Britain, yet they all were slave owners. So that's another topic. But it's so fascinating, the history. On my podcast, we talked to a historian who explains that the Sir William Johnson and the Tories and the independence seekers, the opposite of the Tories, had all these issues going on back then. But what struck me was they didn't want to be slaves to England and they didn't want to be taxed. So it's funny how that worked.
Right, right. And of course, what does the Democrat Party want to do? They want to enslave us all with high taxes. Rich, it's great to meet you, sir. Rich Giardino, I should say. Thank you very much.